Warno, as a next-generation game made by Yugen Systems, it is, quote, the spiritual successor to the acclaimed wargame series. While the game has made some improvements to the loop that were much needed from the last series entry, in 2014, Red Dragon, it has in part regressed in other areas or suffers from change or other weird design choices just for the sake of it, all of which I will be covering today, along with all of the more weird but not detrimental stuff. Keep in mind everything I will say has to do in relation to my personal experience with the game, and mostly focuses around 10v10s which I play most often. However, some of my points will apply to the whole game. Now, keeping that in mind, let's just jump into the good that the game improves on before we go into the more questionable aspects of this, quote, spiritual successor. First, one of the main improvements Warno has from Wargame is all of its quality of life changes, the ability to order units where you want to go before the match starts, and the line of sight tool which allows you to see where your units can see and where they can't, which is already a big step up from Wargame's non-existent line of sight tool. There are also some gameplay improvements and additions, starting with building mechanics are less jank than they used to be with a new cooldown mechanic. Along with that, there are now multiple types of buildings with varying height that infantry can either use to their advantage, or have used against them in a way that very much adds to urban combat, along with you being able to put multiple infantry types in one building. Infantry themselves are also improved in a certain aspect. First off, infantry can now only use squad automatic weapons on the move and not medium machine guns across the board, instead of it being determined by how trained they are. Because unlike in a wargame where Huns can accurately fire an MG3 while running, most people probably wouldn't be able to fire this thing accurately while moving. Here's some Insurgency Sandstorm footage to prove my point. There is also the ability to forward deploy airborne and recon units to capture positions early, which leads to more interesting and varied early game engagements, and gives airborne units a distinct purpose. Although now airborne aren't the only units with a distinct purpose now. Commander units can now buff the stats of units around them, and in a lot of cases now better defend themselves against all threats with an increased weapon arsenal or utility like man pads or smoke grenades, instead of just being a useless unit that hides in a zone. Military police also buff nearby units with decreased suppression damage, and security units act as impromptu recon if you're unable to deploy proper recon. Infantry classes as a whole have been far more diversified also, so people don't just do things like solely spamming V90 or the like anymore. And one of the final things I want to go into detail on is the map design. While all corners of the map aren't as important as others, the way the maps are designed doesn't leave huge amounts of unused wilderness or space, and most places on the map will at least have a few units, unlike in a wargame, where there are huge tracts of easily exploitable wilderness. Spawn placement is also more decentralized, so people can go and temporarily cripple a team's ability to call in reinforcements by flanking, even if they hypothetically do manage to sneak into one spawn. Nor are starting points centralized on a point or two, so artillery on starting convoys like in wargame just aren't as useful or feasible to pull off as it is in wargame. And before I forget to mention all of the model, sound, and graphical improvements that Warno has over wargame, just look at these screenshots proving it. So to start on the things Warno does wrong, and please do note that these are just my personal faults with the game. If you enjoy the game, despite or because of these changes, that is more than fine. On to the most important thing, this user interface is far less clean and simple than in wargames, as it attempts to ground itself more in reality. While the change could be nice, it is executed somewhat poorly, with various updates slowly improving on aspects of the user interface, like the armory or etc. Still, overall, compared to wargame, it is a bit of a downgrade compared to the simple buttons and small screen user interface. Now secondly, on to the gameplay itself, and there is a lot of things about it. So, first, in terms of balancing, the game is all over the place when it comes to unit balancing, either by availability, stats, or otherwise. Firstly, vehicles across the board have been buffed, and infantry are generally a lot less strong than in wargame, where they are far more potent as units. Their availability has also been heavily reduced, so unless you are running a heavily specialized deck, you won't be able to fill the front line very easily with a good number of infantry even in your own lane, and because of this artificial reduction, infantry becomes less important for fulfilling their own role. On to vehicles, tanks are way too potent in the game. They aren't invincible, but deal far more suppression than they did in wargame. And if you have a blob of very good tanks, like T-80s, M1A1s, Leopard 2A4s or etc., you're guaranteed to win a side, or at least give your opponents a headache in the attempt. Here is some video footage proving this. Keep in mind this example is very much exaggerated, as I was able to build up many more tanks than normally possible, but it still happened in a real match. And because there isn't as easily a way to deal with tanks as in wargame, cluster bombers are weaker in general, and because tanks get their own smoke launchers, anti-tank guided missiles become less relevant when your opponent can just shield themselves by the literal click of a button. Helicopters are also artificially more annoying because they get electronic countermeasures and generally suffer from more favorable RNG than their wargame counterparts, but otherwise they are mostly the same. Now here is one of the points of this video that I feel might be a bit more controversial. I think recon proper and artillery are a bit too strong in the game, but let me explain why. Let's start with the main thing. You no longer have a sixth sense to know when your stuff is spotted magically like in a wargame, where the unit icon will stop blinking, so you will have a target painted on your head without ever knowing. This isn't my main issue, and personally I don't mind, but it does contribute to the other parts of the artillery problem. Then the second problem is building destruction. Now that might seem random, but unlike in wargame, building blocks can be destroyed, so you first get targeted, then the building you are in gets destroyed also, so you can't reuse it for whatever it was before, like an anti-air, anti-tank, or recon post. Therefore, in the case of extreme artillery spam, it can make it harder to gain or keep ground, either in defense or on the offensive. This is a real big issue in a game whose entire map design usually has at least one or two important urban centers per map. And the third problem is artillery generally being way more effective against armored units than in wargame, where artillery, unless you hit like 4 howitzers, merely tickled or slightly annoyed tanks, instead of completely de-atomizing them like they do in Warno. And don't even get me started on the napalm artillery. It's so absurd that it'd require a whole second video just to fully rant about it. It's so punishing and cheesy even compared to its wargame counterpart. It's unreal. It hurts like cluster and high explosive, and still has the ability to kick units out of forests, buildings and etc. But now that I've had my say on artillery, onto the actual unit statistics themselves. Unit stats have been fumbled in all sorts of weird ways. While some unit types and weapons have brand new stats, others retain their wargame values for range, AP, or damage on top of new range scaling, which leads to very weird combat, and in part slightly archaic combat, that doesn't fully account for all of the new gameplay changes of Warno. Starting with infantry, damage, suppression, and range on all weapons have all been adjusted. The main damage itself is based on squad size, or number of people holding X weapon now, which leads to very slow and sluggish infantry combat compared to wargame, where fights are mostly determined by massive infantry or outside interventions like artillery, infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, and/or aircraft. Now let's take helicopters and manpads. Only range has been adjusted, not accuracy nor damage, at least for manpads, which doesn't account for helicopter electronic countermeasures, and that fact some helicopters can survive more than 3 manpads shots from some of the lower-end manpads, which leads to frustrating gameplay in which helicopters can easily dodge their main counter, or in some cases even easily kill manpads which should otherwise be a threat to them. Now then, also on helicopters, their anti-tank guided missile ranges have not been adjusted at all, yet all manpads, and quite a few vehicles have a range buff on their armament. Here is a flash montage of the ones I noticed, but I am sure there are quite a bit more. So this also leads to singular helicopters being ineffective against anti-air spam, because if they go in even at max range to try and get even one quick anti-tank guided missile off, they'll risk being blown out of the sky, which then leads to a bad cat and mouse game of who can spam more of what to keep their ground safe and/or dangerous, more manpads or aircraft. Speaking of, also manpads generally seem to be more effective against aircraft and Warno. I don't know if this is because of the increased range or just people being even less cautious with their aircraft and Warno, probably a mix of both. On infantry anti-tank suppression. Infantry anti-tank is way too suppressive against tanks. Tanks will get stun-locked by just getting hit with a light anti-tank weapon, even if they barely take damage. This is far too dramatic of a de facto debuff for being hit by something that barely hurts it in some cases. And before I finish on the topic of light anti-tank weapons, light anti-tank guided missiles, like the Dragon, had their range nerfed a while ago. Ever since they've become extremely redundant, as they already didn't have the longest range or accuracy before and are easily prone to being spotted by recon because of their low stealth. Now and finally, to discuss the other non-unit side of things before we wrap it up. Firstly, income management. Instead of wargame, where income gradually builds up, it instead accumulates in one minute intervals, which leads to people floating thousands of points before they realize they have them, because they forgot about them, at least for players who are not used to it already. That isn't healthy in large-scale games where people need to keep large amounts of units fielded at one time. And speaking of the game size, tactical games in this game are not small or tactical, unlike in wargame. Income is high, the game mode is conquest, and you get very large amounts of points on the start. And even after all these years, there isn't an in-game auto-balancer based on levels or anything. So higher level teams' tax still cause constant one-sided games, where the main factor is how many hours the other team has over yours. This part of the video covers aspects of the game that don't affect gameplay of the game, but still detract from the whole experience. This part in particular is probably the most opinionated, however, so please take everything in this section with a salt shaker. Starting, the animations for infantry are far more stiff and unnatural looking than in wargame. Weird movements, somewhat lacking firing animations. The only animations that feel far less stunted are the ones reused from wargame. The game loves to use artificial intelligence for both its art and some unit pictures. Frankly, it's uninspired, lazy, and jarring to see in a game. like this, and there might be a million other things to say about its implications, not just in this game, but in the industry at large. But that could be its own video, so let's move on to the other soulless thing the game does: downloadable content. I would have put this in the bad category, but none of the content in the purchases are as blatantly annoying or game-breaking as war games, at least from personal observation, although I have been told there are a few problem units by other people. My main issue with these is just how expensive all of these will inevitably become by the end of Warno's run, even if the price of them all gets lowered over the years, but it could always be worse. The second to last thing I want to mention is the division system. While I personally don't have much issue with it, I've seen other people say it limits deck creativity. Personally, I think it's fine for changing up the game from wargame in a more realistic way. But I do understand where they are coming from, with not being able to make solely ex-national motorized or mechanized decks for some. And finally, some of these infantry models are just nightmare fuel. I mean, what's with the oversized eyes? And to add on to the weirdness, some of the other infantry models look normal in comparison. I mean, just look at the comparison. With little left to say on the game, I shall make my final verdict clear: the entire game is mid. It's not necessarily bad, nor overly good. Its faults drag it down, but its improvements keep it up to the point where it's not a super strong successor to Wargame, but good as its own thing in isolation. Unfortunately though, it did come after that 2014 product, so it'll at least for now be remembered as a weak Wargame successor. Although I will say, I did have a bit of fun getting into Warno to make this video. Anyways, before I ramble myself off a cliff, make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Now bye.